In this module, what we're going to be looking at is how you would configure Informatica Big Data Management, what it takes to install the product, what are the pre and post installation checks that need to occur before you actually install the product. Like I said, after this unit, you should be able to describe how BDM software is installed, be able to understand the pre-installation, post-installation requirements, and review the PAM for the Hadoop distribution support. Here, what I would do at the PAM, when we get to the PAM section, I would want to talk through how you would decide and how you would see what Informatica Big Data Management supports for 10.0, the Hadoop distributions that it supports for 10.0. Okay, so the first step is obviously setting up a domain, right? In the architecture section, we talked about an Informatica domain and we talked about different application services. Typically, when I do an installation, I usually have an Informatica domain set up. I set up the Power Center services, which include Power Center repository, Power Center integration service, and then the Informatica platform services, the model repository and the data integration service. Now, one thing I should state here, not all customers will have a license for Power Center. So when you do an installation, make sure you do the pre-work to identify what the customer has in terms of application services that can be stood up. So like I said, typically I'll go in and I'll set up an Informatica domain, I'll set up the Power Center services, I'll set up the Informatica platform services. And then we talked about how each of these services connect, right, to Hadoop. What is Power Center used for? Reading and writing to Hadoop. The Informatica platform services for the data integration on Hadoop, the push down to Hadoop. And then once I have the Informatica domain set up, I have a Hadoop environment. Now, typically the Hadoop administrator would set this up, right? So they would, if your customer would set up a 10 node cluster, 50 node cluster, 100 node cluster, either production or, in dev, they could have a small node of maybe 5 nodes. But typically the Hadoop administrator would configure the Hadoop cluster with a supported distro, Hortonworks, Cloudera, MapR, with one of those distributions on the Hadoop cluster. So once, from an Informatica perspective, once I have my domain set up, the next thing I need to do is install the Informatica Big Data Management binaries on each of the data nodes, right? So it doesn't go on the primary name node, doesn't go on a secondary name node, it doesn't go on Hive, it doesn't go into an H node. Where the binaries are installed, they're installed on all of the data nodes. Okay, so that I mean, it sounds easy to do, but it does take some pre-installation. It does take some post-installation to set up an Informatica BDM environment. Now, this doesn't cover, I should actually clarify, this doesn't cover how you'd configure a Kerberized environment, right? So if your Hadoop cluster is using Kerberos as the authentication tool, this module does not cover that. That's a separate topic, and it's a little bit more complicated to configure these services. But again, with the help of the Hadoop administrator, it becomes a smoother process to set up. I just wanted to recap on this, right? So why do we need to install Hadoop on each of the clusters? So let me just run through this, right? So we've talked about what happens when we actually process data on the Hadoop cluster, right? What happens when we leverage the MapReduce framework, the Hive on Tails framework, the Spark framework, and the Blaze engine to process the data, right? So what happens, in context of Hive, right? We convert the Hive QL, we convert the mapping to Hive QL. It is optimized, converted to MapReduce, submitted to the Hadoop cluster yarn to go and process, right? Any advanced transformations within the mapping, they're executed on Hadoop and they're called through user-defined functions, Hive user-defined functions if you're using Hive on MapReduce to execute. And then the same thing happens with Spark, right? The mapping is converted to a Scala program. Scala program is sent to the Spark executor, and then the Spark executor executes the program on the Hadoop cluster. And same thing with Blaze. Mapping is converted to highly optimized C++ coding, and then it's submitted to the Hadoop cluster to process, right? So this is a very high level, quick run through of how you process on Hadoop. So you've seen here, okay, when we make these user-defined function calls, it leverages the binaries on the Hadoop cluster. And then what happens when you process, right? Each phase is broken up into an extract phase, transform phase, and then the load phase. And you can see, if you look at the calls that it makes, right? Infa native UDF call strings. These are temporary functions that get called during the mapping run based on the complexity of the mapping and the advanced transformations that you have in the mapping. So to recap, why do we need to install Informatica BDM on the Hadoop cluster, right? So first, it's a subset. So remember, when we install the binaries on the Hadoop cluster, it's a subset of the data transformation libraries that are run by the integration service. So it behaves just like how you would run a mapping in native mode, or like in Power Center, right? When we run a mapping in Power Center, it leverages the DTM engine. In the same way, in the Hadoop world, in the world of parallel processing, the BDM would leverage the DTM process on the Hadoop cluster, and that's why we'll be able to support MapReduce, Spark, and Blaze. Blaze is when you execute in Blaze, right, it is written in C++. It does leverage some of the functionalities of the binaries that we install on the Hadoop cluster. We talked about Hive, where it creates user-defined functions, and these user-defined functions are invoked during mapping execution based on the complexity of the mapping, right? So look at some of the advanced transformations that Informatica provides that are not supported in the Hive mode of execution. Though those are translated as part of the UDF. Same thing with Spark. If you're using Spark, they're translated to Scala program, and then we have UDFs that get called for advanced transformations that get executed on the cluster. And then you'll use BDM to connect to relational databases or complex files that you read from the DIS machine, right? So these are the reasons why you'd want to use, or these are reasons why we need to install BDM on the Hadoop cluster. Okay, so in terms of Hadoop requirements, right? So I talked about having a Informatica domain, talked about having the services installed and configured. Obviously, you need to have a Windows machine, typically your laptop, your desktop with the Windows 7 or supported Windows OS that will run the Informatica developer tool. You need to configure Hadoop pushdown properties in the DIS using the administrator tool, and you would need to change the developer tool to point to the right Hadoop distribution that you're using. And we'll walk through some of these. I'll show you some of these properties here towards the tail end of the Okay, so that was the non-Hadoop requirements, right? So these are things that are not related to Hadoop, right? These are outside of the Hadoop cluster. On the Hadoop cluster, what will you look at? So we have some requirements. We'll look at the installation that's taken place. We'll do a setup check, and we'll look at the ports that need to be opened. You'd need at least 700 meg of local file system. Remember, not HDFS on each of the nodes, because the binaries they do take up some space there. Like I said, right, in the previous slides, it's a very skinny version of the Informatica DTM engine that has been packaged for the Hadoop cluster. you would need an HDFS user account, and this will be the same user account that starts the Informatica services on the Informatica machine, right? So if I installed Informatica domain, if I install and started Informatica domain and application services using InfoUser, that InfoUser account must be on HDFS. So your Hadoop admin can help you install or set up the HDFS user account. So there's a couple of ways that we can install Informatica BDM. If you're using Cloudera, you can leverage Cloudera Manage and distribute the Informatica BDM binaries on the cluster using Cloudera Manager, and we have parcels created specifically for Cloudera Manager, right? If you're using the installer that Informatica ships, what you need is to have sudo or root privileges, passwordless SSH connection between the node, because remember, what you'll be doing is that you'll be distributing the binaries, the RPM package, on all of the data nodes, and then you have the ability to distribute the RPM package, right? So it's either FTP, SCP, or NFS protocols, or HTTP. This is documented, so you can take a look at the Informatica BDM administrator guide, installation administrator guide, and it'll tell you how you can configure your environment to distribute these packages. And then network requirements. In the architecture diagram, it talked about connectivity, port connectivity, and showed the high-level interaction diagram, right? So you need connectivity between your Informatica Linux server, your Informatica client, your source target databases, and the Hadoop cluster. These are the, I'll say this when we get to the ports section, but it is important to have your ports open. Make sure that your connectivity exists between Informatica server, client tools, and the Hadoop cluster. Okay, so that was the pre-installation requirements, right? One thing I should note before we move on to the next section is typically when you are doing a Informatica BDM installation, customers will always have a Hadoop admin on hand, and these requirements, if you look at these requirements, these are, like I said, these are very Hadoop specific requirements. So you'll have to work with your Hadoop administrator to install the binaries on Hadoop. So what happens with the installation, right? So you install the RPM package on all of the data nodes in the Hadoop cluster. One thing I should say here is that when Informatica BDM, the package, these are binary files. These are static jar files. They don't run, they don't consume any CPU. They don't consume any resources. They're only invoked at runtime by the engine, to convert the mapping or to make UDF calls to convert or to invoke some of the advanced transformations. So we install the RPM package. We install third-party binaries on the cluster, and this is going to be like your Oracle client to connect to databases, your ODBC driver, your DB2 drivers that if you're going to use DB2 as a database. So you need to install third-party binaries on all of the cluster. So if you have native drivers, so one of the reasons that you'd install the Oracle client, this is specifically for profiling, right? So if you've got a task that you're profiling data on the Hadoop cluster, you would need to install like the Oracle client, or native, I'm just going to call it native relational database driver on the Hadoop cluster, on the Hadoop cluster. Now, when I say on the Hadoop cluster, it's not HDFS. This is going to be on the local file system, and the reason is that when you profile the data, the profile warehouse is typically stored on a relational database. So what Informatica would do is, run your profile, the profile stats get gathered, and they get sent back to the Hadoop cluster, to the relational database, and that's where it's stored. Make sure that the Hadoop cluster is supported. You must, in one of the things that you would need to do, right? This is again a pre-install requirement. Always check to see what version that your customer is running, what Hadoop distro version is your customer running, and check that against the Informatica BDM PAM. The last thing that you want to do is when you install Hadoop on, when you're out at a customer site, you typically don't want to get there and find out that they're running a older version or a brand new version of a Hadoop distro that's not yet supported. That doesn't really go well. And then look at the supported version of Hive. Look at the Hive metastore. Would support MySQL, Oracle database. Derby is not supported as a metastore. The Cloudera's, Hortonworks, MapRs, they don't support Derby as a metastore. So make sure you understand what that metastore, what database the metastore is running on. So typically what I do is when I go out and do an install and do a pre-install check, I'll check to see if the Hive metastore services have been started. And again, depending not depending, typically you will have a Hadoop admin on site with the customer. So, checking to see if the Hive metastore is started, making sure the Hive service is running. This has been taken care of for you by the Hadoop administrator, right? But what I do is that, remember I talked about having a Linux user created. I'll log on to the Hadoop cluster, make sure I can navigate, I as in the user account can navigate through the Hadoop cluster, be able to do a Hadoop FS listing, make sure I can log on to Hive, make sure I have access and the right permissions to create tables on Hive, right? Selecting from a table, just these sanity checks to make sure that I have connectivity to the Hadoop cluster. Ports. This is something that that always comes back to bite us, is ports, right? By default, when your Hadoop admin, or when you do a Hadoop cluster install, and you run through the Cloudera Manager or Ambari and you install the software, they'll install the software and they'll have their services running on default ports, right? So they'll have it on Hive Service 10,000, the Metastore, the MySQL port. These are all default ports. But you have to go back and you have to go check and see what are the ports that they're using, right? So this is a partial list of all the ports that are being used on the Hadoop cluster. Now, these ports are all specific to all the Hadoop services. These ports aren't specific to what Informatica would use, right? So Informatica ports are different on the Informatica server from the Hadoop cluster ports. So first thing you would do is make sure you get a list of all the ports from the Hadoop admin, because we will be using some of these ports in our configuration step, right? In our post configuration step. Also note that at times customers will not use the default port. So if you think that you can do an install and you can do a post configuration accessing the right ports, and you use some of the default ports and you run into issues, I'm pretty sure that they're running on a different port than what is the default location. Okay, so what we've covered so far, right? We've hypothetically, you've installed Informatica BDM on the cluster, where you've either run the installer, you've run the installer, used Cloudera Manager to install the package, and you're ready to do the next post-install steps, right? So what's the post-installation, right? So if you think about how the architecture works between Informatica server and the Hadoop cluster, Informatica has to know where your cluster is, how to access the Hadoop cluster. So in a way, the Informatica DIS, the data integration service, is a client to the Hadoop cluster. So typically what you would look at is you look at the following files, right, that are from the Hadoop cluster. You'll look at yarn site XML, you look at HDFS, you look at MapRev, you look at core site. And if you look through this configuration, these will tell you, what your job history server is, what your yarn resource manager is, your HDFS location, name node location, map reduce. If you're using Kerberos, it'll tell you, give you details about all these configurations, right? And what you'll typically do is you'll gather this information, and one thing I should say, I won't go through all of the properties, right? You'll see the example here at the bottom. These are some of the properties that you need to get from the Hadoop cluster, and these are documented in the help guide. But what you would need to do is that you look at the configurations that the properties that you need, and you would map it down to what file which file it's located in, and then you would update a location, and this location, this info home, is on the server that's running the Informatica services, right? So info home here in this slide is pointing to the DIS. Wherever your DIS service is running is a server. You need to log on, navigate through services shared Hadoop, Hadoop distro configuration directory. Hadoop distro here is, if you're using Hortonworks 2.3, if you're using Cloudera 5.5, and so forth. Look in the configuration directory, and there's a file called Hadoop env properties, and you'd need to update that file accordingly with the required properties. But in 10.0, what we've done, and in 10.1, is you have this BDM install utility, and this BDM install utility will go out to your Hadoop cluster and derive all of the properties that are required for Informatica to interact with the Hadoop cluster. So you run this installer just like you would do if you were installing the Informatica software, and the installer would ask for your let's say you're using Hortonworks, it'll ask for the Ambari location, the admin user, username, password to access the cluster information. It'll pull this information out for you, and it'll copy the file over to this configuration file location that I've specified here. So this utility does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, and it's pretty nice, because prior to 10.0 in 9.6.1, you would have to manually go in and update the properties file, and if you miss one properties, you spend hours trying to figure out why you're not able to run a job on the Hadoop cluster. So remember, as a post-installation check, once you've installed the BDM binaries, once you've got your domain up, you've got all your application services up and running, run the BDM install utility, and this utility will do 90% of the work for you in terms of getting your Hadoop cluster properties and updating the configuration files on your DIS server. Okay, so post installation, what do I look at post installation? So there's a couple of things, right? Log on to the Informatica administrator tool, and you click on your DIS, and so navigate to the DIS properties, and you would look at the first item, right? So it says Informatica Hadoop directory on Informatica home directory on Hadoop. So when you do the install, what Informatica does, it installs in the default directory /opt/Informatica, and this is going to be on the Hadoop cluster. And then the Hadoop distribution directory, right? So if you're using Cloudera, Hortonworks, MapR, Big Insights, so forth, you would need to specify what that directory is. And then the last thing is data integration service Hadoop directory. And this is going to be, again, wherever your DIS is running, what is the Hadoop distribution directory. And then you have properties here for Kerberos, SPN, service principal name, or key tab. If you're configuring for Kerberos, you would have to update these properties as well. One thing I wanted to point out here is, because I'm showing the developer tool, you look at the home directory. By default, what Informatica does, it just leaves it in the Tomcat bin directory where the Informatica services are started. I typically recommend customers to change that directory to a shared directory, just like you would do for a PowerSyn integration service, right? So here I just pointed out, okay, I'm going to use my cache, DIS source, DIS target, DIS reject directories. Okay, so Blaze, right? So what we've done so far is, if we go back a couple of slides. So in the post installation, right, when you run this installer utility, what you've done is that you've configured Informatica BDM to leverage Hive on MapReduce, Hive on Tez for processing. But like I said, now we introduced Informatica Blaze. So what do you have to do configure Informatica Blaze? So go back to the Blaze slide. Now, when you install BDM on the Hadoop cluster, you've already installed the binaries for Blaze. You've installed the binaries for Hive on MapReduce and Hive on Tez, and then as well as for Spark. But in terms of getting to leverage the Blaze execution engine, what is the main things that you need? One, you need to have an application timeline server. I've covered this in the I'll cover this in the introduction to Blaze. But you need an application timeline server. Again, this is a Hadoop specific service that is typically configured by your by your Hadoop administrator. If you're using Cloudera, you would need to manually start up your application timeline server. If you're using Hortonworks, this is already done for you, so you don't have to do anything. And then to enable Blaze, I mentioned the Hadoop env properties file. So if you go to the env properties file in the shared directory, there's a property for InfraGrid Blaze console enabled. Set that to true and save the file, and then you're done. Then you're good to go to use Blaze, right? Okay, so what I've talked about so far is installing BDM on the Hadoop cluster, configuring the properties, talking through the post installation process of getting the DIS, which would be the client to the Hadoop cluster, to leverage it for processing, right? And talked about the utility, the BDM utility that will go and update the properties. Talked about configuring Blaze. So the next step is developer tool configuration. Developer tool, I need to create a couple of connections, right? One would be the HDFS connection, would be the Hive connection, and then these are the two connections primarily that I would use. And what we've introduced in BDM is a Hadoop connector. So we'll walk through that as well. So in terms of HDFS, what do I need to do? I need a username that has access to HDFS. So typically, again, this is a user that has been created on HDFS by your Hadoop admin, and I need the name node URI. And if the Hadoop administrator doesn't give you the access for whatever reason, or doesn't give you the information for whatever reason, look at the HDFS site XML, navigate to the name nodes, to the FS default name property, and you'll find what the name node is, right? So you just got to put in your username, you put in your URI, and you're good to go. For Hive, right? So there's two ways we can do this, right? When you access Hive as a source, as a target, or you use Hive as a to run the mappings on the Hadoop cluster. So if you use Hive just to access the source and target, remember in the architecture, I said to access Hive, you'd use Hive Server 2 to access tables that you'd use in a mapping, right? If you look at the properties, right, this is just your Hive Server 2 location. Again, the Hadoop administrator must provide you the information to where your Hive Server 2 is located. And then in terms of runtime property, database name, your default file system. There's no concept of job tracker job tracker was a predecessor to Yarn. So you need to look at what your Yarn resource manager address is. Look at your Hive warehouse directory, and then look at Metastore execution mode. So there's two ways we support Metastore execution mode. One is remote, one is local. Recall we talked about how if you have a Metastore that is running in remote mode, how that works, and then how local mode would work. And then your remote Metastore URI. Again, these are all the properties that you can get from your Hadoop admin. Before I jump onto my environment and show you what this looks like, let me just cover the PAM, right? So for BDM, what you need to do is log on to the informatica network, and on the right hand side they'll have, I believe, product availability matrix, and look for the 10.0 or the 10.1 PAM, and this is what you'll see under the tab for big data management. For big data, you can see what the OS is. Red Hat is what is primarily supported. We will look at the version of Red Hat, and then look at the distribution, right? So on the right hand side you see Cloudera, MapR, Hortonworks, and Big Insight. So these are the distributions that we support. These are the Hive distributions that has been certified against, right? This is an example, so do not, and I'll say this loud and clear, do not use this slide to refer of what is supported in BDM. The PAM is always changing in order to support the latest release from the Hadoop vendors. So make sure you log on to the informatica network and get the latest PAM, right? You do not use this as a reference. Okay, I am going to go ahead and log on to my environment so then I can walk you through some of the installation steps. Okay, so I have my environment. My environment is running on Azure. If I log into my administrator tool, I walked you through my environment, part of my environment during the architecture section, right? So look at the services. I have my BDM services up and running. I've got my model repository. I've got my DIS set up, right? So what does this look like when I do an install, right? So let me log on to my environment. So here I have BDM server, right? So if you look at, go back to my browser, you see BDM server. So all my services are running on BDM, right? So if I do whoops, so this is where I'm running my informatica processes, right? So run a PS listing of see what processes are running. So these are all my processes that are running on the on my informatica server. I have my 5 data nodes that I've set up. So like I said, right, So first step is I got to make sure that I've got a domain set up, right? So I've got a domain, and I've got all the services that I need, right? So I've got the model repository, I've got a DIS set up. So if I go back here, this is going to be my Informatica server, and let me go to, let's pick a node. Okay, so what happens here is sudo to root. So when I ran my installer, the Informatica BDM installer, it installed into a default directory, opt/, right? So there I see Informatica. Look at Informatica, and I can see services, shared, and Hadoop, right? So on all of the data nodes, these are the binaries that get installed. And look at the Hortonworks, do a listing here. And I see these are the configured directories. These are the binaries that are packaged for supporting Hortonworks 2.3. Now, if I go to in cd configuration and I clear here and I say do a listing, so notice these are the configuration files that we need to update, right? So these are all the binaries that get installed on the Hadoop cluster, right? So this is all the static binaries, and you'll see them on all of the data nodes, right? So if I go back to my BDM server and I go back to my info home services, services shared, if I go to my Hadoop directory, to listing, go to Hortonworks. Okay, so now if I do a listing here and I see that pretty much the same binaries that were packaged for the Hadoop cluster that are also on my Informatica server. So if I look at my configuration files that I talked about, right? So these are my yarn site, my MapRed, my hive site, and my HBase. So if I do go through and I look at that, and if I look down at the bottom, right, here I tell Informatica DIS, this is the location of my yarn resource manager. If I'm using HBase, these are my zookeeper addresses. So this is one of the files that update yarn site, right? If I look at MapRed, it will tell me what my MapReduce job history directory is, what my job history address is. Look at the MapReduce class path, and then the MapReduce framework, right? So I'm leveraging yarn for this. So these are the properties that get updated when I run the BDM utility, right? So once I've done that, once I run the utility, actually, let me go ahead and navigate to where the utility is, right? So you guys can see tools, the location of that utility. So if I clear my screen, this is going to print working directory. This is going to be in tools. I do a listing again. Go to BDE utilities, right? So do a listing and print working directory, right? So this is going to be in my Informatica home directory, tools, BDE utility. And if I run this guy, and I can just kind of go through it, this will go ahead and start the installer, and it'll ask me, run through a series of questions of where's my Hadoop cluster information, right? So agree to that. What am I using? I'm using Hortonworks. What version of Hortonworks I'm using? I'm using 2.3. How do I want to connect to the Hadoop cluster, right? So remember I said what the installer will do is it will connect to the Hadoop cluster, and it will pull pull all the properties that that I need for the Informatica DIS to talk to the Hadoop cluster, right? So here I can choose Ambari. If I want to run this on HCF2, I can give Ambari host and give the username, give the password, and give the port that it's running on. Do I want to use TES? I can say yes. It'll go configure TES. So obviously I didn't specify any of my any of the Ambari properties because this machine's already configured to connect to the Hortonworks cluster. But this gives you an idea of what you need to do to run the installer, right? So once you run the installer, let's quit from here. Then you go to your Hadoop configuration directory. You'll see that you have all of these files will be updated, right? So when I ran the installer, it took a backup of the original files and then it appended the new values related to my Hadoop cluster in all of the configuration site XML files. So if I go back and I talked about what I needed to run to use Blaze, right? So if I look at info configuration directory and I look at a listing and I go vi hadoop env properties file. So look at this env properties file and I can see the property here that says infogrid Blaze console is enabled is true. Now one thing that we'll talk about when we go through Blaze, so these are some of the properties that you need to and that you can configure Blaze, right? Can configure for Blaze. So this environment properties file just basically sets the environment variables so that when you execute a job on Hadoop, Informatica knows the location of certain attributes, certain properties. So here we looked at the properties to enable Blaze, and then I said the last thing that you need to do Blaze is actually make sure that your timeline server is on, right? So here's my application timeline server that has been started, that is automatically started when I install Hortonworks. So I don't need to worry about having this application timeline server starting up. Okay, so the last thing would be updating the DIS properties, right? So click on the DIS, go down to execution options. You look here, I said Informatica home directory on Hadoop. Remember here, on Hadoop. So it installed, when we did the install, I installed it in opt/informatica, then Hadoop distribution directory. This is the distribution directory on the Hadoop cluster, right? So these two properties are related to where the Informatica BDM binaries have been installed on the Hadoop cluster. And then the last thing here is data integration service Hadoop directory, right? So I'm using 2.3, so I make sure I change this to 2.3. Okay, and then the Hadoop connections, right? So log on to my developer tool. I go to my preferences. I go over to connections, cluster, Hadoop. So I'll walk through a couple of three connection objects here. One is the cluster connection. And what the cluster connection is when we're leveraging the smart executor that we'll talk about over in the Blaze section, it uses this connection object, the Hadoop cluster connection object, to execute your mapping on Hadoop. So in the first tab, right, is just general properties, give it a name, and you look at common attributes. What are the common attributes that each of the engines that we support use, right? So one is the resource manager address. This is telling Informatica where my yarn resource manager is located, and then my HDFS direct file system URI is located. Since I'm using Hive pushdown, I specify what my default database is, where on HDFS this is located. Look at my hive server 2 JDBC string. Again, remember, you need to work with your Hadoop admin to get these properties. And then look at hive configuration. I'm using remote. I have a thrift, my thrift server is, and looking at my engine, right? So I'm using Tezia. I can specify MapReduce too as well. And then Blaze, right? So Blaze is very straightforward. I just need a few properties for it to run. Okay, so this is the first property. This is the first connection object that I need to set up. Second one that I would set up is a hive connection object. Now this hive would tell, I would use this hive connection if I have a hive source or a hive target. So here I have two ways to access or to run mappings, and you've got hive server 2 or CLI. If I look at hive server 2 properties, I'm just going to select again, just going to point to where my hive server 2 resides. There's another way of processing data using hive CLI. So I specify, which is the same thing that I just talked about, right? So database name, FS URI on resource manager, and then remote metastore. And then the final connection that I would need is HDFS. So if I look at file system, expand file system, and go there, and look at my details, that's my name node URI, right? So again, this is where how the DIS would access HDFS. Okay, so I'm going to cancel out here. Oh, the other thing while I'm in here, right? So if I need to set up other connections, I can set up other connections, right? So I've set up Oracle. I need to pull data from an Oracle table, and any other connections that I need to set up that would be relevant for my big data processing, right? Okay, to wrap up, I walked through how you would configure BDM, talked through the pre and post installation requirements for you to successfully have BDM talk to the Hadoop cluster. I showed you the different properties files, showed you where on the Informatica DIS to look for the BDM utility. I looked at post configuration, how that works, and also set up how the DIS to ensure you're actually using the right Hadoop distribution, and then finally reviewed the PAM. All right, and that concludes this module.